There's a question that doesn't get asked much anymore. Not because it isn't important, because most people assume they already know the answer. The question is, when did you decide what food should taste like? Not what you prefer, what it should taste like. What registers as normal? What your body expects when you open a package, crack a can, or sit down at a table. Because somewhere between the generation that grew up eating butter and the generation that grew up eating margarine, something shifted, and no one really voted on it. In the decades following World War II, the American food system underwent a transformation that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. It wasn't loud, it wasn't announced, it simply became the new baseline. Margarine replaced butter on millions of tables, not because families asked for it, but because it was cheaper, shelf-stable, and backed by messaging that made butter seem dangerous. Hydrogenated oils became ubiquitous. Corn syrup began appearing in bread, ketchup, salad dressing, yogurt, crackers. High fructose corn syrup followed, sweeter and cheaper still. Sugar was added to foods that had never contained it: tomato sauce, peanut butter, canned vegetables. The average American's sugar intake climbed from around 12 pounds per year in the early 1800s over 150 pounds by the year 2000. Most of it wasn't coming from dessert, it was coming from everything else. Flavor enhancers entered the supply chain quietly: monosodium glutamate, autolyzed yeast extract, hydrolyzed proteins. These weren't listed as artificial flavors, they were often classified as natural because technically they came from organic matter. They made cheap food taste richer. They made processed food taste like something it wasn't. And portion sizes grew. The average dinner plate expanded from 9 inches in the 1960s to 12 inches by the 2000s. Soda servings doubled, then tripled. A small popcorn at the movies became what a large used to be. The concept of a normal amount of food quietly inflated, and everyone adjusted without quite realizing it. Children born into this system had no reference point for what came before. To them, this was just food: bright, consistent, convenient, and everywhere. It didn't rot quickly, it didn't require much preparation. It tasted the way food was supposed to taste because it was the only taste they knew. And that's the part that matters. Not that food changed, but that a generation grew up inside the change, with no memory of what eating used to be like. What disappeared wasn't always obvious. It wasn't as if grocery stores stopped selling fresh produce or whole ingredients. You could still buy them, but they were no longer the foundation. Traditional fats were among the first to go: lard, tallow, butter. Fats humans had used for millennia were reframed as dangerous. In their place came oils extracted from seeds and grains: soybean, canola, cottonseed. These oils required heavy industrial processing, hexane solvents, high heat, deodorization to remove the rancid smell that naturally occurred during extraction. The final product was shelf-stable, tasteless, and cheap. It was in everything. Whole grains were replaced by refined flours. The bran and germ, where most of the nutrients lived, were removed to extend shelf life. What remained was starch, which the body processed almost identically to sugar. Bread that used to take hours to make and days to go stale could now be produced in minutes and last for weeks. It was softer, whiter, blander, and it required additives to mimic the texture and taste that used to come from fermentation and time. Fermentation itself became rare. Foods that had been preserved through careful microbial processes, pickles, sauerkraut, yogurt, sourdough, were replaced with versions that used vinegar, pasteurization, or chemical stabilizers. The living bacteria that had once populated these foods, and by extension the human gut, were no longer part of the equation. Meat changed too. Animals that used to graze on pasture were moved into confined feeding operations.
Their diets shifted from grass to grain, mostly corn and soy. This altered the fat composition in their tissues. Omega-6 fatty acids increased. Omega-3s decreased. The meat was fattier, faster to produce, and cheaper. It also tasted different, but that difference became the new normal. Even fruits and vegetables were different. Selective breeding prioritized size, appearance, and durability over nutrient density. A tomato in 2000 contained measurably less vitamin C, calcium, and iron than a tomato in 1950. The same was true for broccoli, spinach, and carrots. The food looked the same, but what it delivered to the body had quietly diminished. And then there was the removal of bitterness. Across the board, foods were bred and processed to be sweeter, milder, less challenging to the palate. Bitter greens fell out of favor. Coffee was sweetened and diluted. Even vegetables like Brussels sprouts were cultivated to contain less of the compounds that made them sharp and assertive. The result was a food environment that trained taste buds to expect constant sweetness and to reject anything that wasn't immediately pleasant. This wasn't a conspiracy, it was economics, optimization, efficiency. But the cumulative effect was that an entire generation grew up eating food that had been fundamentally altered, not just in how it was made, but in what it was.
The body adapts. That's what it does. It adjusts to what it's given, and over time it begins to expect it. Children raised on high sugar, high salt, hyperpalatable foods developed taste preferences that reflected that environment. Studies began to show that early exposure to processed foods could alter the brain's reward pathways, making whole, unprocessed foods seem bland or unappealing by comparison. It wasn't just preference, it was physiology. Metabolic conditions that had been rare became common. Type 2 diabetes, once considered an adult disease, started appearing in children. Obesity rates climbed steadily across every age group. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, virtually unknown before 1980, became one of the most common liver conditions in the country. These weren't purely genetic shifts, they were environmental responses. The gut microbiome, trillions of bacteria that play a role in digestion, immunity, and even mood, also changed. Diets low in fiber and high in processed ingredients reduced microbial diversity. Certain beneficial bacteria declined. Others, associated with inflammation and metabolic dysfunction, increased. The shift was measurable within a single generation. There were subtler effects too. Attention spans seemed shorter. Rates of anxiety and depression climbed. Some researchers began exploring links between ultra-processed diets and mental health, noting that the gut and brain communicate through pathways that depend on the quality of what's eaten. It wasn't definitive, but the correlations were hard to ignore. Culturally, something else was lost. The knowledge of how to prepare food from scratch began to fade. Families that once cooked daily meals now relied on pre-made options. Skills like bread making, canning, butchering, or even just knowing how to season a pot of beans became niche. Cooking was reframed as a hobby, not a necessity. And with that came a dependency. People who didn't know how to cook were dependent on the companies that did, and those companies had no incentive to prioritize nutrition over profit. The impact wasn't uniform. Wealthier families had access to farmers markets, organic options, and the time to prepare meals from scratch. Poorer families did not. The result was a growing divide, not just in income, but in health outcomes, life expectancy, and the ability to pass down food knowledge to the next generation. By the time anyone thought to ask whether this system was working, millions of people had already been shaped by it. Their bodies, their habits, their expectations. The question wasn't whether they could change, it was whether they even recognized there was something to change from. There's a moment, sometimes, when you taste something made the old way. Bread from a bakery that still ferments its dough. Butter from a farm.
Vegetables grown in soil that hasn't been stripped and replenished with synthetic fertilizers. And the thought that comes isn't, "This tastes good." It's, "This tastes different." Because somewhere along the way, different became the baseline. And what we think of as normal is actually new. Very, very new. The generation that lived through the transition is getting older. The ones who remember what food used to taste like, who learned to cook from people who learned during a time when cooking wasn't optional. That knowledge is fading. And what's left is a population that grew up inside a system they didn't design, eating food they didn't choose, shaped by preferences they didn't consciously develop. This isn't about blame, it's about recognizing what happened. Because once you see it, you start to notice the other systems too. The other things that became normal without anyone really deciding. The other ways we were quietly shaped. And you realize this was never just about food. It was always about control. Not the dramatic kind. The kind that's so slow, so embedded, so multi-generational that by the time you notice it, it already feels like it was always this way. But it wasn't.